Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back. This week I have on my good friend Michael Verdino to talk all about Y the Last Man series by Brian K. Vaughan and hopefully I'm going to say this right, Pia Guerra?
I think that's how you say it, but I'm not a good reference either.
Yeah, so it's a 60-issue series, which, you know, for comics that is quite a bit of a series, and especially now that we see a lot of like the 6-issue miniseries, or you know, Marvel and DC will start over every year, it seems, or every couple of years. So Mike, you recommended this to me initially, so why don't we sort of start with why you recommended this and then go into an overview of it?
Yeah, I have a weird little history with this book. When I was in college, I hadn't read it yet, and I had one of my best friends had the whole series, and he had like I have the trades that are like, you know, 4 or 5 issues together, and that's like there's like 10 of them. He had like the ones before that were like even more broken up. So there was like 16 books or something. It was just something absurd.
Oh wow.
And maybe I'm remembering that wrong. Maybe at the same ones, he just really old editions, and then they were really crappy. But he like loved this. And I lived with 6 of us in this apartment my sophomore year, and we all read it over the course of like a week and a half. Like
nice. Every
single one of us at one point was like, that's all we did for like 2 days was read this. And it was just like really like frantic kind of like eye twitchy thing where like you'd always know who was in the middle of reading Y the Last Man that week, because that was the one who was like, I haven't gotten sleep. I haven't slept. I couldn't sleep. I had to read the next one. And then I fell asleep trying to reread it because I missed some of it. And then there was an incident that occurred that one of my friends thought he was Yorick Brown one night when he was drinking, and like ran away from a cop or something. It was this whole thing with it, and you and I started talking about comics probably like a year after you and I met. Like we kind of like started realizing we were both like read comics and stuff, and you were kind of getting back into comics, and I had maybe beaten you by a year about getting back into it. Like I had just found my local shop, and I had been like really digging into reading, and I think I was like, you should read this, and you never got around to it, and here we are like, what, 4 years later?
Way later. Yeah, and you know, I hadn't really been into comics much before that, so I was sort of just like asking around anyone I knew who liked comics, like some recommendations and stuff, and then once I left Drexel and got a job, that's really when I started like buying a bunch of trades and everything. And it's funny that you mentioned the more broken up series, because from what I can tell, there's those 10 volumes of, you know, like 5 to 6 issues each. And then they had deluxe hardcover editions. Right. They had 5 of those. And then they made those into the trade paperbacks for the 5 books, which that's what I have. Right. I have the 5 thick books. And now they're still releasing editions of this, because there's one set to come out later this year for the Absolute edition, which those are like the big oversized hardcovers.
Right.
So the third and final Absolute edition is going to come out this July. So it's like this comic has had so many different releases that it's sort of hard to keep track of, you know, which is which.
I think I got my buddy Sam, who got me into the comic in the first place. I got him a few of the limited editions one year for like his birthday or something, and when they were coming out, and I just remember being like, "Oh, this is so sweet! They're putting a limited edition." I saw they're putting out more, and I'm just like, "All right, maybe we've run the ship a little bit to the ground, because it's not been that long. It's not like it's been like, you know, it's been 15 years since the last time we released something. It's like, you know, every couple of years we're just like, hey man, everyone loves Y the Last Man, so."
Yeah, I didn't even realize how long ago this came out either, because, you know, the very first volume came out in 2003. Yeah. So obviously the comic started probably 2002, And, because I waited and bought the paperback books, those didn't come out until a span of them from 2014 to last year.
Right.
So I just got finished collecting the books last year, which is probably another big reason why it took me so long to read them, because I was like, can you come out so I can just like have them all at once? And, you mentioned you and your friends staying up because you had to read the other one. With the 5 books, it's kind of nice because it's like if you take in a book a day, it's like that's plenty, because it's, like I believe the first book was 10 issues, and then it ranged anywhere from like 10 to 12 or 13 issues for each book. So it's like you were getting a huge chunk of the story at a time. And I was just like, yes, I love this. And I'm pretty sure on Goodreads, I gave it all 5 stars all the way across the board, because I was like, yes, I love this. So thank you for the recommendation. But, before we get in too deep, why don't we go ahead and give the overview of sort of what this story is all about?
Yeah. So if you're one of the few uninitiated, if you're talking about comics and you're listening about comics, you probably have read this story. It's one of those stories. Basically, something happens. And there's a lot of potential reasons why. And in one brief moment, every single man on the planet dies. And the only man left alive is Yorick Brown, who is kind of a loner. He's got a pet monkey, and his girlfriend is currently off in Australia. His mother's a congresswoman. He's kind of from like that, like kind of weird upper middle class East Coast kind of family, very liberal kind of family, and he's just a kind of he's really into magic and like weird quirky history, like Elvis and that kind of stuff, and but like all weird facts about Elvis and none of the normal stuff, and like weird Houdini and all that kind of thing. And basically for no explained reason, really early on, he's the only man left, and it goes through the story. Basically tells kind of the conflicting adventure of the people trying to figure out why he's alive and why everyone else died. Yorick just wants to get to find his girlfriend in Australia, and it evolves into a much bigger story about the different, not only the geopolitical kind of stuff, like all the people who are trying to find him, but also him going through his journey of like, fuck, I'm the last man. Like, I'm the last, literally the last, pair of balls in the world that can, repopulate and all of these kinds of things. And suddenly, this guy who kind of wanted to make nothing of himself is very significant for a number of reasons. And it's kind of like telling the story of something that's way bigger than that. Like you're trying to explain, trying to explain Game of Thrones. You're like, it's a bunch of people who all want to have power. And then you go, well, it's way more complicated than that. But,
right.
But yeah, that's the premise. And it gets as trippy as it gets at times. It's one of the least trippy, long-running kind of stories. I've read other Brian K. Vaughan stuff that gets way more into the deep end of weirdness. This is definitely the beginning of where he kind of enjoyed doing weird, like, dream sequence stuff and, like, oddity stuff like that. But it's amazing. I mean, if we wanted to end the podcast right there, we could just be like, it's amazing, read it. Bye.
Yeah. And obviously, spoiler alerts for anyone who hasn't watched it going forward or hasn't read it, although you will be able to watch it soon. Yeah. So there is that. I know Mike and I have been texting back and forth quite a bit about the TV show that FX is currently working on, and Brian K. Vaughan is actually going to be at least one of the writers for the show. So before we dive into the comic, though, Mike, are you excited to see this sort of come to life in a TV format?
I'm as excited as I can be without being obscenely nervous. Because for a bunch of reasons. Because there's people I'd really like to see in the role of Yorick and all the other characters, 355, Dr. Mann, but there's also like we've seen a lot of success for some stories that come into play, like Walking Dead, that have done really well on TV, and a lot of the fantasy series that have done really well. I also am nervous. Like, there's always that nervousness of being like, there's some of this stuff that you want, for lack of a better word, you want it to be able to have its time to mature.
Right.
That it's not really a slow burn initially, but there's parts of the story that are really great because they are a slow burn, and they take their time. And you don't want it to be like, well, we got to get to the next big piece of exposition, or we got to get to the next big adventure that they have. But there's also the comic is written in a really kind of almost TV-ish way at times, where, like, you know, people, they'll start a comic with, they'll be kind of like running away from something that they just did. Like, there's a bunch of times where in the story they'll be, you know, like they'll be running away, like, out of a warehouse or something that someone's shooting at them. And it's like,
right.
after something has occurred, and you're kind of like, no, I wanted to see that. That sounds like fun. But, you know, what's really brilliant about some of the writing is saying, hey, well, the more interesting thing about these people is the relationship. And that's what I always really appreciated about two of my favorite TV shows, Chuck and Firefly. That they were willing to make the exciting part of the adventure not be the main focus.
Right.
Where you'd have these little exposition episodes where it'd be like after a really interesting mission, and them, like, kind of being like dealing with the fallout of it, or dealing with the aftermath, or just like dealing with the interpersonal issues they have after the big event. And it's a comic, and it does that, and they have the choice to do that. And I hope that the TV showrunners can do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it does help that they're, you know, having Brian K. Vaughan involved in the process since he wrote the story and everything. So I think FX does a pretty good job of sort of doing adaptations justice, because I don't know if you've been watching Legion at all right now.
I haven't. I need to.
But yeah, that is like the show a lot of comics fans are talking about right now. And that's even whether or not they knew anything about the character Legion to begin with, which personally I didn't. And I've sort of started going back and reading, I believe it's X-Men Legacy, which follows the character and everything. And it's not, you know, exactly the same as the comics. And I think if they tweak a few things here and there, it'll still be a really good adaptation. But, you know, this is about the comic book. So maybe when this comes out, you and I will have to podcast about the TV show and sort of do a follow-up episode here. But you mentioned, you know, in some of the issues, there's a lot of times when, you know, they're being shot at or these sorts of things. And we even have, you know, that train scene in Y the Last Man where they're trying to travel by train, and, you know, Yorick is spending a lot of time pretending he's a woman in this, just so they can sort of get from point A to point B. And I think what I really liked about this too was they took all the time they needed to find Beth. And, you know, in the last book, if you have the 5 collected editions, that's when we see them find Beth finally. And it's like, I'm sort of glad they let it play out the way they did, because I feel like if they had found Beth, like, you know, halfway through the story or something, it wouldn't have had the same effect.
Yeah, and I think the storytelling in this is always really compelling to me, because it's this idea of like a slow burn. Like, I think the real arc of the story is more about is a lot about, not more about, but a lot about Yorick understanding himself and understanding like, not maybe not his purpose, but like where he stands in the world. And you know, there's a lot of really interesting things that happen with this character. There's the suicide intervention that occurs with 711, I believe.
Right.
Who basically, you kind of, like, early on, there's a lot of these little, like, hints, if you go back and read after you've gotten to that issue, that Yorick is essentially suicidal and was suicidal before he decided to leave his apartment when the incident first occurs. Because, as you can imagine, half of the population dies. That's bad enough, right? But having some sense that you're the last guy around, and there's also hints that he did go out right away, like early on, to try to go find like a friend and be like, hey man, you and I both, I think we both think this was something stupid that you and I did that kept us safe. So it must have been you. And he shows up at this guy's place and he's dead too. And he doesn't know how to handle all these things. And so he starts becoming kind of agoraphobic and doesn't want to leave his house. And there's more kind of statements towards him like doing really rash and stupid things and hoping that someone's going to kill him, so that it just be over with. Because then we won't have to deal with all this bullshit of me being the last man. There just won't be any more, and it can end with me, and I don't have to worry about it. And that's a really telling moment when 7-Eleven, one of the other culprit ring agents, basically, intervenes and does this whole crazy, just absurdly wild moment in the comic, and which is probably the first moment that I think you realize you're reading something that the writer and the illustrator are ready to go crazy.
Right.
Up until then, it's very the drawing and the writing is all very fixed in reality. And that issue hits, and you're like, oh, we just took some LSD.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those types of moments throughout. You get the Daughters of the Amazon throughout this too, and they always are bringing something crazy to the table, it seems. And then, we have the astronauts coming back too, and it's like Yorick will get these glimpses of hope here and there that he's not the last man.
Right.
And then, it's like they're trying to figure out what to do with the astronauts because obviously they were not on Earth when the plague hit, so they're still alive, but they're in space.
Right.
And it's like as soon as they hit Earth, it's like, okay, how do we keep them alive? Because everyone else has died from this. And they just have these crazy moments. And then even later in the series with Dr. Mann and her family, which is a whole other type of crazy. And basically, Yorick ends up finding out he is not the last man, but he still ends up being the last man again anyway.
Yeah.
And then, Dr. Mann finds out that her father had been cloning her. And there's a bunch of mini Dr. Manns running around at various stages in their lives. And it's sort of creepy and extremely forward thinking at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just one of those moments you're like, okay, this is happening towards the end. So where are they going to end this comic? And it's like, they kept outdoing themselves throughout. And I think, the way they ended it when they sort of jumped quite a bit into the future and everything. And, it just ended with Yorick leaving. I think that was a really nice moment and it sort of wrapped everything up nicely.
Yeah. And this is the thing I wanted to talk about most. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about. We can get to that. But I think the ending, I just finished rereading it this morning because I was re-going through everything. And I kind of forgot how much I loved the way they ended the series. And not because I was like satisfied and happy and good with it. I tend to find that like the endings of stories I'm really into have a few possible ways they can go. They can be super satisfying and right where I want them to be. Like they kind of fit into that pocket of like what you want to have happen, and you feel like you know where everyone's going and what's happening to everyone, and it's good. Like, you go, okay, I like everything, all the decisions that were made, and I don't think I need to think about this too much more. They've handed it to me and packaged it in a way that I'm satisfied that I don't need to go out and like try to talk to someone else about like, oh, what about this? What about this? For some people, people will disagree with me. Like Harry Potter's epilogue does that in a lot of ways. Kind of packages things up. It's a little bit too clean, but it's as close as I can get in my first brain, thought.
Right.
You kind of go like, all right, cool. Like, I know where everyone is. I feel like this is like I know there's compelling stories I could go off with, but I could be happy right here. And then there's also stories that I feel like wrap things up too nicely, and it's not very satisfying. It's kind of like those fantasy series where, like, at the last second, the idiot magician suddenly comes up with like the most amazing way to do something they've never been able to do before, and you're like, well, no, he's never been able to do that. Why can he suddenly do it now? Like, that kind of stuff. And it's like, great, everyone's satisfied, but you kind of feel like it wasn't that compelling of an ending.
Right.
This is that weird one where I'm not happy with everything. Like, like not everything's the way you want it to go. I mean, one of the biggest story beats at the end is to be completely spoilerish, 355 getting shot, and right after he figures out that Beth was going to leave him anyways, and all this other stuff, and he finally is getting on the road to being happy, and all these good things are happening in the world, and everything that could go wrong does go wrong, and it's not satisfying the what happens, but it's satisfying the way it's told.
Right.
Like, I'm very... There's a sense of closure when you finish reading this that you go, yeah, I might want to see some of that stuff. Like, I would love someone to just, like, explain to me, like, what happens with the government and the world. Just, like, I'd like to have Brian K. Vaughan tell me those things. But I don't need any more comic. Like, I don't need any more book in this. Like, they've given me everything I need in the comic form. I might just want to sit down with Brian K. Vaughan over coffee and just be like, and how would the world work now? Like, just tell me about it. But I don't need someone to draw it for me. I just need someone to tell me, like, hey, what were you thinking would happen? Oh, that's cool, and then I could walk away. But there's that thing of, like, a satisfying ending versus an unsatisfying ending where you're going, like, no, there's more story. There's definitely more story, and you haven't told it all. What the hell?
Right.
And so I think that this is a great example of how you write an ending, even if it's not going to make everyone happy.
Yeah, and it's like we almost got two endings with this too. Like you mentioned, 355 being shot, which I was not happy about, and I'm sure you weren't either.
No.
And, then we get this sort of last issue that jumps into the future, and we see Yorick sort of locked away with a ton of clone monkeys.
Mm-hmm.
And just there are clones of his younger self walking around, and, he makes his one last escape. And I think that was sort of satisfying because it showed that despite everything that happened to Yorick, especially that sort of first ending we saw, he still largely stayed the same and still sort of did things the same way he was throughout the story. And I think that sort of ending is what made that so nicely wrapped up, even like you said, if not everyone is going to enjoy it necessarily. Right.
Well, it's kind of that thing where you go, like, at some point in every story like that, everyone dies, right? Like, even if by old age or sooner, everyone in a story dies. It's, it's still imitating real life. If you haven't clued in, I'm a realist, people die. So there is like, you kind of do want to, like, when you read Harry Potter, if you're really connected to that character, you really want to know everything that happens his entire life, because there's something compelling about that. And
exactly
what is done really well in that last issue is hitting some of those big story beats. And I think it's really intelligent. It's kind of like preemptive. It's like someone might go, well, wouldn't Yorick clone 355? Cross that off the list. Let's talk about that. Let's give it a reason why not. What happened to Beth?
Yeah.
Well, hero. Weird. What happens... what happens to the monkeys? Like, nail that. Like, what happens with Dr. Mann and the research? Cool. How does the cloning thing start happening? Cool. And so that last issue does a really good job without putting you onto new story beats, hits you with a couple of key moments and shows you, more importantly, how Yorick kind of lives the rest of his life. And so you can fill in the details, but it hits the things that are going to be the most crucial to explaining the story and tying up loose ends. And and any story is going to have a few more things. Some people are going to lean into other things more than others. But I think that's really compelling, and I think that it's really difficult to write that. Like, I think it's an incredibly challenging thing to do well. And you also have to have, when you're dealing with a medium like comics, you have to have the mastery to display it artistically and visually in a way that people aren't going to feel like you're just hitting them with a page of quick text and dialogue. It's got to actually have, visual clarity to it, which can be really challenging. And I think people don't realize all the time. And you and I have talked about this before with, like, one of my favorites is the Flash and Manipool series, where it's really difficult to draw the Flash. And that's
Right.
because of the powers with the Flash, but it's also really difficult to compellingly do dialogue in general that doesn't just feel like I'm drawing characters standing around and I'm filling up the text bubbles. You're dealing with a medium that needs to kind of have some ebb and flow and motion and action, and it's that last issue just works. So
Yeah, I totally know what you mean. And the thing is with this, obviously this was meant to be these 60 issues and that was it. But when you have characters like the Flash, basically any of the characters that Marvel and DC have, these characters are going to keep coming back for different stories and different storylines. So I feel like it's a lot harder to sort of wrap up a series like Why the Last Man than it is to do a run on the Flash or Batman or something like that, because it's like those characters are always going to exist in some capacity, at least as long as, we've known comics and everything like that. These characters have existed. What happens in the future, obviously, is remains to be seen. But I can't imagine, DC getting rid of Batman or the Flash or even,
right.
Superman, Wonder Woman, any of those main characters that have been around so long.
Well, yeah, and I think the other part of it is that, you're also not dealing with superheroes, the first thing, but there's, the first beat.
Yeah.
But it's also that anything that deals with something, the incident at the beginning is going to at some point deal with the theme of, like, mortality, and to have your characters not die and not deal with the bigger issue of if this is the last man on Earth, what happens when he dies is
Right.
almost a bigger deal than what do you do when he's alive. Because that's the much bigger concern is then you go, okay, I've got a timeline. I've got 60 years, right? Hopefully, where this person exists. And if I don't do something to make sure that when that 60 years is up, he's gone, we have something to solve our problem. Well, that's the end of the line. So at some point, I think it's almost required that you have to let this person die or solve the problem of what happens when they do. Because otherwise you haven't really, more or less you've handed someone, this is going to be one of the themes. This is one of the things we have to talk about is what happens when this guy dies and mortality in general, because his death could mean everyone's death.
Yeah, and I want to sort of backtrack a little bit here and talk about the plague itself. Obviously, when it first happens, no one has any inkling as to why it happened, what caused it, or anything like that. All, Agent 355 and Dr. Man knows that there's York and there's a monkey, and that's about it. And they're thinking initially, the monkey is what kept him alive. And, as the story goes on, it's like they don't really start piecing things together too much until they see Dr. Man's father, but it's like they get little pieces here and there, and Dr. Man sort of can advance on her research and everything like that. And I thought it was just interesting that they wanted you to sort of have that thought throughout the comic too, like, okay, why do we still not know what caused this 40 50 issues later? And I think that was another thing that made it really well done. It's like Brian K. Vaughan gave you a certain amount of information to start the story, and it was just enough to keep you interested throughout the whole 60 issues.
Yeah, it's in my book, this story is not about, like, in some ways, like, this isn't about the fact that, what do we do? It's not about what do we do to solve this problem. It's definitely more about Yorick, his mental state, and the people around him that he interacts with, and all these other people that are, have to deal with this problem. It's a very character-driven thing, and it wouldn't be compelling if it was just some guy who happened to be the last guy who was pretty bland, kind of a frat bro, and was just like, yeah, man, get me to California, get me laid, let's do this, It would be a much less compelling story, and so it ends up being that's like, I don't want to say that that's like the MacGuffin of the story, like it's the thing they're trying to figure out of like why, because they never really confirm what it is.
Right.
But it kind of does act a little bit as a MacGuffin like that, like, okay, thing we're chasing is why, and how to deal with this. But realistically, that's just the thing that's advancing the plot. It's not the actual story.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, it ends up ultimately acting as just a vehicle for a more compelling story in a lot of ways. And I think that what makes it work is that the story beat is compelling constantly. If you're not someone who's into literary comics that make you think about people and characters, there's always the idea of, well, there's a plague and every man dies, so when's this guy going to get the girl? That's really cool. Just like Firefly has always got the idea, like, Firefly is an incredibly character-driven show that could do an episode where they're all sitting around in the spaceship and they don't do any cool space things, and it would be really awesome, but it is ultimately a show about essentially space pirates. And so you can always do an episode where there's a heist going on, and you can tell something very interesting about a relationship between two people, and the heist can be the thing that people who came to the story for, and then they stick around for the people and the mystery and all that kind of stuff. I mean, the main mystery of Firefly was, who is this girl and her brother, and why does the government want this girl? And that's always there. But then you'd have an episode where they're just like, we're going to go rob a train.
Right.
And you'd be like, okay, cool. That sounds like fun. And then, but in the meantime, they're like they're trying to explain the characters' relationship so that 2 episodes later, then one of them decides to betray someone. You're like, oh, well, back then when that guy got pissed about the other guy getting and being in charge, that's why he would do that. And it's all about like building this better understanding of who these people and these characters are. And I think I love character-driven fantasy and sci-fi stuff, and you do deal with that, like that kind of like, let's set you up with a compelling story, but then let's make you stay for 60 issues because you like the people, the characters, and the world we've created, not because you're going, well, this mystery is going to play out real good in the end.
Yeah, and I think while the story largely revolves around Yorick and his situation, you still get these strong surrounding characters that really are what make the story worth reading. And, Brian K. Vaughan doesn't really beat you over the head with his political opinions or social opinions in this, but you still see glimpses of them because obviously there are so many industries that even today are still, male dominated, especially like, working in factories and that sort of thing. So all of these women suddenly have to not only take over all of those jobs, but if there's stuff they don't know how to do simply because of how male dominated certain industries were, they have to sort of just figure it out themselves. And we see all these little, I wouldn't call them encampments, but like these little towns and everything throughout where the women are sort of trying to make their own way. And each time it's like they're doing it in slightly different ways. So it just goes to show how much thought was put into even characters that we might only see for an issue or two at most.
Yeah, there was I can't reference it because you're using a different series than I am, but when they were on the ship that ended up being a heroin ship,
yeah,
I that was the only time where they kind of nailed it on the head, like really aggressively with the dialogue. She's going down with the ship. Yorick comes in and is like, you got to get off the boat. You got to get off the boat. And she was like, she basically goes, you know, at some point, you know, suddenly there's a man back in the picture and everything revolves around you. And you got to save the girl. And you've got to go with this, like, you know, tried and true broken dialogue. And there's a lot of little things here that I think if someone was to try to write this again, and maybe this is the bigger fear that I have about a TV show coming out about this, is that a lot of the little things that they've done narratively, like kind of trying to make Yorick the damsel in distress in some ways, and making him the, you know, making him the minor character in a sense, like relative to the world, but still super important, and all that other stuff that a lot of shows have since done, a lot of TV shows, a lot of books have since done, that I think, considering our current, you know, political climate and with the modern feminist movement, that might seem trite or seemed a little bit difficult to realize, like, this was one of the books that I think did this first and did it really well. So that I when I was thinking about this before we started talking, I was trying to think about how best to talk about that, because it is a really it's like a challenging subject to discuss without having someone else like reading the book in front of you.
Right.
Because there's some really great moments in this series that have to deal with the narrative reality of Yorick being the last man on Earth. You have to deal with this fact that if that's the case in the world, Yorick's very important. You know, whether you want to admit it or not, very important. Right. But the other side of it is that he's also not that important, because there's only one of him. And so if you're of the belief that, like, you know, only men can lift heavy things, well, guess what? There's only one of them. So
right.
You're going to have to learn real quick that that's not true and never has been. And so there's a lot of points in the story that I think in some ways do a really good job of stressing kind of that importance of, we've made this character narratively important, but we're also trying to make the point of, yeah, but in reality, maybe not so much. Like, you could have a society that could function ultimately, and that's what they show towards the end of it, with the last couple issues, that that society gets more and more functional as time goes on, that you could have a functional society without men. And the only reason why you're keeping Yorick around is because he has sperm. And even that's kind of going to the wayside as Dr. Mann gets her claws into cloning. And so there's the narrative element, and then there's the non-narrative element that's like, let's talk about the realities of the world, you know. And so it's a weird commentary, because I can see a lot of people overreacting to it. Not to say that I think that's a bad thing in some ways, because I think that there's definitely parts of this that if you read just one couple pages of Y the Last Man, you might get really upset with it, feeling, you know, chauvinistic or, you know, disparaging of women because of the way they make a man a centralized plot in a book entirely about women. But you could also do some really interesting things narratively to talk about that kind of weird balance that this puts you in.
Right.
And fantasy is all about showing you extremes and showing you empathy. I really like, there's a great book that I read recently, Steelheart. It's a series by Brendan Sanderson, that not about women and other stuff, but like talking about extremes. It's the idea is that people start getting superpowers, but it makes people assholes. So basically only bad people have superpowers. And it's really interesting because it's showing this extreme of what if only awful people were really, really powerful. And it creates this absurd reality, this absurd situation but it lets you consider what happens when you give bad people power, just in general. And fantasy is a really great tool for that, and comics and sci-fi and all these things, because it lets you create a scenario that's very extreme, because I can bend the world and reality in whatever way I want, and then forces you to deal with that, even though it's nothing like your own reality. I can give you an entire extreme that you have to reconcile with. And then you take back the moderate version and go, oh yeah, bad people with a lot of power probably isn't so good.
Right. And I think, even though York is a white man in the comic, because of the fact that he's the only guy left, it sort of gives this comic a chance to have a lot more diversity than we've seen in a lot of the comics, from Marvel and DC. And this is a Vertigo title, which is part of DC, but it's, the more mature section of DC, basically. And the fact that this comic started in 2002 and had this sort of concept of, hey, there's going to be one guy and a ton of women in this comic. And then, Dr. Man is of Asian descent and Agent 355 is African American. So right there, just within that small group, he's sort of giving you this diversity right off the bat there for, as soon as the plague hits. And York isn't like, he's not a manly man by any means.
No.
And I think that's sort of what makes him more likable in this comic too, because he's sort of bewildered by the fact that he, of all guys, is the last guy on Earth.
Yeah.
And, I think the York we see at the beginning is very, very different from the one we see at the end. He still has sort of that snarkiness to him with all the jokes and comments he makes throughout. And, we see him slowly growing on Dr. Man and Agent 355. And I think, they did a really good job of not necessarily being like, oh yeah, don't forget, we have a white male as the last man alive.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I think just his characterization helps a lot with that too.
right. And so I think ultimately it comes down to this idea of, something that's a lot more noticed right now in storytelling, especially on TV, is this idea of, create stories that are compelling, use characters that show diversity, so we understand the differences between people, and make sure that you're making decisions that that tell a story that is interesting, not a story that you feel you have to, like, that you feel obligated to tell because it's what someone said. Okay, well, we should have this and have that.
Right.
And I think that's maybe my biggest concern when we talk about the TV show is I am 100% okay with changing genders and ethnicities and all that stuff for TV shows and casting. I think the Ghost in the Shell stuff is a load of crap, and all of that other stuff that's been going on as far as like Hollywood casting is just ridiculous for these kinds of things. The concern I think I have is, it kind of touching on what we had talked a little before, is someone seeing this show today and going, and how do you make sure this show seems relevant, like the comic was relevant and kind of ahead of the game in presenting some of these ideas narratively? Because there's a lot of TV shows that have made a character that is flipped in some way, or like against their typical narrative, and I think that's the challenge. Is you've got something that was as ahead of its time when it was written narratively, coming up with these great ways of telling stories. A lot of things have done this since, and a lot of great comics have done it since and taken cues. And I'm sure a lot of people who have written really great fantasy TV shows and such and books have taken cues from Y the Last Man. It's incredibly popular, and what it did for narrative writing and fantasy and comics was really significant. So I think my biggest worry is you put out a TV show, you do one season, and everyone's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's cool and all, but like, I've seen this before. You're like, no, you haven't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, the diversity in comics is a big discussion, especially as of late. And, for me, it's hard to, I shouldn't say it's hard, but, Marvel and DC have spent so much time developing characters like Batman and Superman. But what I think, when people want this diversity, they should probably handle it more in the way of what Brian Michael Bendis did with Spider-Man, where you have Peter Parker and Peter Parker stays the same, but then you have this new Spider-Man in Miles Morales. And, you don't need to change the race of a character just for the sake of doing it, when in the universes like Marvel and DC, there are so many of the same character with different names that you can just, make a new character to have it be more diverse. Like, how many Robins has Batman had? There have been quite a few, and they didn't just go changing a single Robin each of those times. It's like, all of these guys have different names. And I think that's a good way to sort of more easily, I guess, incorporate that diversity, because then you're creating new characters and you're hopefully making fewer people upset because you're not changing these characters that have been a staple. And even a character like Black Panther or Luke Cage, these characters Marvel created a while ago. And I think they just need to keep creating new characters. And I know Marvel has done that with, I believe, Riri Williams being in the new Iron Man comic and everything, and she's going to have her own thing going on, I believe. So if you just keep adding characters to these stories, I think that's sort of a much simpler way to create these diverse characters that people can relate to and people can love. And, we've even had different Hulks over the years. You have Bruce Banner, and then I believe the other one is Amadeus Cho. And it's like, you don't need to just change things. You can just create new things instead.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that helps. I think the other part of it that's really important, though, is making sure your writing teams are diverse. This is a big issue in TV shows. You need to make sure that you have people with a lot of backgrounds, and that's not just to say racial diversity. Just to generally need a lot of different backgrounds to tell compelling stories. Yeah. You need to acknowledge that the multicultural nature of the world that's consuming content now. And I think I agree with you to an extent. I think there's also instances where the other challenge is that those characters that you create are awesome, unless you're creating a character just to have included something that you don't have.
Right.
And I think the reason why I like things like Riri Williams is it's making a statement of anyone can be Iron Man. Anyone can do this. And, it's not, being Iron Man is not being a rich billionaire white guy. Being Iron Man is all the things that Iron Man stands for, and the intelligence and the creativity and, what you stand for. And that is not just something a rich white man can do. And so there's a really important statement to do there. There's also, but then there's also like Miss Marvel, which is, awesome.
Kamala Khan.
Yeah. And that's, but there's an instance where you go, I'm not creating a new character. I'm in a sense, I'm adding.
You're repurposing the same title. Yeah.
Right. And that I think is really important. And I think that's where I go. I think it is important in some cases to put some diversity into the characters themselves, replacing them, doing things where you say, yeah, I am going to make, Miss Marvel a Muslim, and I'm going to do these things because, and the people who read these comics and read these stories are forced to recognize what's the same and what's different. And I think that's the big thing to me is always about acknowledging our similarities so that we can then talk about what makes us different and what isn't so different. Like, it's like, great, we're really similar. You're like, cool. And you're like, and yeah, I got this one thing I do that's different than you. And it's like, well, yeah, but we got all that stuff in common. So we can still talk about that because we're not going to have a problem with that because, like, we're basically we're all chill. We're all good. And
Right.
so I think there's kinds of a lot of ways to go about it and a lot of challenges that some of the challenges I totally acknowledge and understand. Suddenly making Peter Parker black doesn't really work. Like, I get why someone wouldn't want that. But also, I also get why someone would be like, hey man, why don't you make Spider-Man black? Like, I can also see how someone could be like, the joke was like, Donald Glover should be Spider-Man. That whole thing where it's like, why not? Like, why not just say he's Spider-Man, he's Peter Parker? Like, what's the problem with making it with a movie that just says, okay, this is Spider-Man, he's Peter Parker, and it's Donald Glover playing Peter Parker? And the same, you kind of go like, I could see why you'd be, as a comic book fan, going like, oh, hell no, man. Peter Parker is Peter Parker. Everyone knows who Peter Parker is. And it's like, well, yeah, there's also a bunch of people who don't know who Peter Parker is because they don't read comics.
Right. And I think...
And they don't care.
Yeah, I think my point was just that, when these characters were created, it's like they were given very white dude names like Peter Parker and Bruce Wayne. So when you have a new character like Miles Morales, that reflects the character a lot more than just calling him Peter Parker. And it's not that, I'm not saying I don't want diversity in comics, because obviously that is something that's great, and I personally loved Bendis's run on Miles Morales when he first did that story. And I think if Donald Glover played Miles Morales, I would be fine with that. I would totally be fine with having a Miles Morales Spider-Man movie. Spider-Man doesn't need to be Peter Parker in order to be a movie. And I think that's more the view I take. And, like you said with Riri Williams, it doesn't need to be a rich white man. Obviously, being rich helps with all the technology and everything, but it doesn't need to be a white man. And, she is this character that's extremely intelligent and knows how to sort of create all these things and tweak the suit and do those sort of things. And like we said with Kamala Khan, she was given a name that fit her. It's not like she was just given this white girl name and, that was that.
I know what you mean. I think it's more that statement of in some instances, like, the naming thing isn't kind of what I want to get hinged up on. It's more that idea of just being like, you could tomorrow conceivably say, I want to make Spider-Man the next movie, and I want it to be about Peter Parker, as everyone knows who Spider-Man is, and we could, what name it is doesn't really matter. It's just, we're going to make a Spider-Man movie. It's going to be Peter Parker. We're not going to try to create a new story. We're going to use the same origin story that everyone knows and loves. And you don't even have to make it any more crazy than that. But I think that's what I'm interested in. And I'm also like, I always like watching how people approach and worry about. I mean, we saw what was seen with the Ghost in the Shell stuff, where Scarlett Johansson being cast for an anime that was entirely, it's an Asian anime, and you have something that you have someone that's kind of getting whitewashed and all these kinds of things that you kind of go like, hey, it's one thing to say like, great, well, she was the best actress in the room, and it's another thing to be like, yeah, but like, you're kind of appropriating a culture here. Well, but I don't want to get too hung up on it, because the other part of it is that as I came into this, as we were going to talk about this, I had a few things about like this kind of thing, like the ship discussion and that stuff, where the other side of it is I'm also an idiot. So I could be wrong about all this stuff and really stupid. And I think, like I'd said before, my biggest, most pressing concern about why The Last Man is a TV show coming out and it kind of coming back into the cultural zeitgeist is people going like, well, yeah, we've been reading these stories for 10 years.
Right.
And not it getting the same appreciation that it did when it first came out, which is a real shame, because it's brilliant. It's compelling. It's still an amazing read. It's probably one of the few things that I would be willing to be the asshole in a comic shop being like, you haven't read Why the Last Man? What are you doing? with your life.
I know. I know when you told me to read it, it was infuriating because I took so long to get through it. And, I have so many comics on my shelf that I've bought and just haven't read because lately what I've been doing is I've been going to the library and checking out comics for free and in the hopes that I would stop buying them. But then checking them out means I have not been reading the ones I want to read or I own anyway. But I think, obviously I am very glad you recommended this to me because it was thoroughly enjoyable. And, at times I even forgot that this was like a Vertigo comic because when I think of Vertigo, I'm thinking, like Preacher and Constantine and those characters that are still, within the DC universe in some capacity. And it was just so different from anything I had read before that it instantly sucked me in. And I know I mentioned possibly talking about favorite moments, but with 60 issues, I feel like we would probably go on for at least another hour if we did that because there were so many things to like about this comic. And I know we just got way off topic here with the whole diversity discussion, but I think that's an important discussion too. But, this story as a whole, it just put everything in a different light, basically.
Yeah. And the great thing, I think that's really telling about this is that Brian K. Vaughan is just awesome. If you're not reading Saga, you should be, which is what he's working on right now. It's incredible. It's just another just brilliantly written, just amazing comic series. And
Paper Girls too.
Paper Girls, yeah. He's just really good. And it's really important that he's one of those guys that you kind of go like, he just really understands the way to write. And Image in general, which is where he is now, is fantastic. Everything that Image has been putting out for the last couple of years has just been really exciting and interesting, and I think he's really tuned in to how to write good, compelling stories that live well, have a long lifespan, which is really great, and really challenging, and not everyone can do that. So. If you haven't read this, you should. If you have read it, you're looking for something else to read, and you haven't read Saga, you should go read Saga. Paper Girls is great, and go back, and Ex Machina is great. I actually haven't read Pride of Baghdad, but I need to, which is supposed to be very good. And I haven't really gone back and read any of his early stuff at like Marvel and DC. But I feel like that's one of those things that I should go check out. But that's on the list.
Yeah, I've read a little of his DC stuff. I think I read his Doctor Strange run. I think it was a mini series. It maybe was only like, 4 to 6 issues, if that. Yeah. And it's definitely interesting to see him write these different styles because obviously with the superhero type stuff, at least Doctor Strange is more, I would say, maybe supernatural than a superhero because of the way his powers in particular work. He's not like a Superman or an Iron Man or something like that. But it was just definitely interesting to see how he writes these different stories too. And I believe I got 3 volumes in on Saga. I don't have my 4 through 6 volumes right now or any of them because I had a friend borrow them. So, I'm going to have to wait to read that once she gets those back to me. But I did read the first volume of Paper Girls and it was very Stranger Things like, I would say, if anyone has watched that but has not read Paper Girls. It definitely had a similar vibe to it, even though it was probably a little more sci-fi than Stranger Things was in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, sweet. I feel like we've covered a lot of randomness and craziness here, which is good.
Yeah, so I think that wraps it up for us today. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening as always, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.